Hey students, today I'm going to be talking about kind of an odd thing. I often uh, talk to students about their need to develop things. I often talk to students about their, images, scenes, reordering and restructuring. One thing that sometimes gets left out of the picture is literally thinking about what you should leave out of the picture. This little video lecture is going to be, we're going to talk about a concept that I call minding the gaps. Mind the gap is a phrase taken from England, and it's about when you go to ride the subway or the tube. There's a gap between the door of the train and the platform, and you need to be careful to mind the gap, not to actually accidentally step into it. What I'm talking about is actually trying to think about gaps and how you use them in writing. And we will revisit this a little bit when we talk about poetry, especially with line breaks, stanza breaks, and caesurae. But in larger pieces, in prose pieces, there are still gaps to consider, and some of them are literal and some of them are figurative. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those. So I'm going to bring up a lesson plan here that we can all look at together. And hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to increase the, well, that's probably pretty good. Maybe increase it a little bit more. So minding the gaps. I have a couple quotes at the top that I'm going to read that are just sort of worth considering when you think about the use of gaps or space or mystery in your work. Okay, so this is a quote from Wolfgang Iser, and from his famous essay, The Reading Process. One text is potentially capable of several different realizations, and no reading can ever exhaust the full potential, for each individual reader will fill in the gaps in his own way, thereby excluding the various other possibilities. As he reads, he will make his own decisions as to how the gap is to be filled. In this very act, the dynamics of reading are revealed. Now that's reader response theory and phenomenology. So basically he's thinking more from the perspective of the reader, and seems to be thinking that most of these gaps are sort of unintentional, just sort of the byproduct of the attempt to make meaning, the gap between what is said and what is intended, and how it's always the listener, or the reader in this case, that fills in that gap. But of course, writers from the dawn of time have realized that they can actually use those gaps for effect, to create tension, to create interest, and create a compulsion in the reader to ask questions, to keep reading, to get more and more invested. As Jeremy Gavrin notes in Notes on Craft, omission is a form of creation. Limit, constraint, and the compulsions of the unknown, the excluded, are the true foundation of narrative art. I don't know if I'd go that far. I think it's a part of the narrative arts. I think that, and it's quite a bit the act of framing. If we think about photography, what gets left in and out of the frame, except that in narrative art, you can create gaps within the picture. This is a note of my own. Just like every work of fiction is inherently fantasy, in that it's always building a world. It's always practicing that art of world building through its descriptions and its scenic development and its characters and backstory. Every work of fiction is also a detective story, in that it is always trying to answer unanswerable questions and make us ask those questions. And so the gaps in narration actually encourage that investment on the part of the reader. This isn't, by the way, the equivalent, the narrative equivalent of saying, I just wanted to leave it up to the reader's imagination. That's just laziness. Narrative gaps are really selective and careful decisions about what they want to withhold from the reader. So the reader has to do a bit of work. It doesn't mean you don't describe a scene. It just means that there might be a piece of information left out, Well, actually, it could mean a number of things, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. There are the different types of gaps that we find in narrative. Okay, first of these I would put as our contextual gaps, which withholding important elements of time, place, and backstory. I actually love the use of context. Context is really important to our sense of meaning, but sometimes withholding some of that, at least for a bit, holding on to it for a little bit as the story progresses, can be really very effective as the reader starts to learn the world that they're immersed in. And not knowing keeps them looking for that world. So we don't know why a character is in a certain place or what has led them there. We begin in the middle of things. In media res is what that phrase is. And in truth, all of our lives begin in media res. So you know, you want to begin at not necessarily at the beginning, which would be, you know, it was a warm and dark place, you know. You want to begin, or it could be in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God. But I think that what you want to try to do is to begin at a point of tension, begin at a point that matters, and think about how you can drive the reader right into the heart of the story. There's also informational gaps, withholding facts and evidence. This isn't often a byproduct of first-person narration, but it could be a byproduct of many different types of narration. And this relates to the next one, which is gaps by point of view, caused by point of view. But informational gaps could come from anywhere. It's just, but oftentimes those informational gaps are created to sort of put us in the position a little bit of a main character who also does not have the information that they need. Gaps caused by point of view. Point of view narrows the perspective of the reader to a particular vantage point, limiting what the reader knows, sees, hears, and experiences to that perspective. So say you're writing a story from first-person narration. There are obvious things that first-person narrator can't know. They can't know what other people are thinking. They can't see things that they haven't seen. They can't be places they haven't been. And the reader is situationally also limited through that viewpoint. They're also limited in terms of literal perspective. Like if a character is looking at a city from the top of a building, sort of very Batman-like, he can't really be seeing what's going on in an apartment 3 blocks away. Now, an omniscient reader can see and know all of those things. And that can be effective too, but that omniscient narrator still has to decide what he's going to reveal and what, or she's going to reveal, they are going to reveal or not. Narrative gaps. Narrative gaps are partially a product of the way time and plot interact in a story. Time and plot are not the same thing. Time is time. You know, it goes 1 second to the next. Plot doesn't necessarily, well, certainly, unless you're watching 24, does not follow time. And even 24 is an hour-long show. So like you really aren't experiencing every minute of a person's life. The narrator is being selective and jumping and leaping from one scene or time to another. Nearly all stories leap over time, leaving gaps in terms of what happens in the intervals. Sometimes, though, a significant event will be withheld from the reader and perhaps even a main character to maintain and create interest and to be revealed perhaps later on. Structural gaps, mostly used in poetry, line and stanza breaks as well as caesurae, but they can be used in stories and essays to indicate passage over time or an important shift in scene and setting. That's just a physical gap on the page. We need a little bit more space between paragraphs. Gaps in understanding. Why a character does something or why something happened and what it means are endlessly interesting and unanswerable questions that add energy to a story. You know, characters' motivations are never one thing, and you want as an author to leave, and even a character doesn't know. None of us know. If we think about why we do things, I've always said that the most honest answer a child can give to a question, and we get mad at children. We say, "Why did you do that?" And the character says, "I don't know." They're not lying to you. They don't know. They just did it. It's adults who come up with justifications for the things we do, but quite a bit of what we do, we just react. And then after the fact, we come up with justifications. We have reasons, but we quite often don't know what they are. As a writer, you really want to you want to be conscious of that, aware of that, and make sure that your characters are as complicated and as confused and muddled as you are. They might think they know what they're doing or why they're doing it, but they probably don't. Gaps in narrative structure. As readers and movie buffs, we all have some basic understanding of how a story works. We understand that there's going to be an exposition where we're introduced to all the characters and the basic situation plot. Then there'll be this little moment where we get, where a problem is introduced. That creates tension and a rising action. And there's this climax, moment of greatest tension in the piece. Then a falling action and a resolution. A very nice triangle, right? But maybe I should start that a little lower so you can see the whole triangle, right? All right, a very nice triangle. But the fact of the matter is those stories that follow that in lockstep are actually quite boring. And if you look at modern contemporary literature, we very often don't get to see a resolution. And sometimes you'll get a very kind of a blip story where there's a whole bunch of exposition and then a tiny little climax and it's over. Or you will be introduced at the climax and then you'll get just the damage done from it, or you'll have the straight, pretty much a straight falling of exposition, rising action, climax, and then chopped off, nothing, no falling action, no resolution. The reason that you do that is so that the reader is left wondering what happened or what could happen or what might happen next. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to close this and then open up the Daniel O'Malley story, Bridge, that we were assigned for today, and hopefully you all read. I'm sure you all did. You're excellent students, right? So there's a whole bunch of the use of mystery and gaps in this essay. Even though we get shown a ton, we get introduced to really compelling characters in the mother and the father in this weird setting that we don't know quite where it is. We get the sense that this kid's like homeschooled out in the woods somewhere. But we don't really even know if we're on, I mean, yes, we know we're on planet Earth because Arkansas is mentioned, but it could be a totally dystopian universe that we're in. We just don't know really where we are. And because all we get is about the 1 mile radius surrounding this kid's little world. And it's a very confined world where the only information he gets about the world is from his very religious parents. And that definitely influences his way of perceiving the world. But even right off the bat, we're introduced to a character and we don't know who he is. He saw the old couple twice, once when they stopped halfway across to pose for a picture, and again a year later when they came back, this time without a camera. And for a while, all they did was stand there. Both times he watched from the window, which was not what he was supposed to be doing. He knew that. He knew well what he was supposed to be doing, which was studying, right? So in the mornings, his mother would tell him things. He would follow her around the house while she did her inside work, then outside where she did her garden work and her chicken work. And he would listen and take notes in his notebook while she talked about the histories of their state, country, and their family, his mother's family, plus his father's family, and then their whole family, then the family they made when they made him, but also about the flood and locusts and frogs and other plagues that had happened before and could happen again. And he would take notes so that in the afternoon he could sit there in his bedroom and study. And then in the evening, after the supper dishes were gone, he could stand and recite for his father what all he'd learned from his mother in the morning. What do you notice there? Well, we don't know how, initially, we don't even, in the first paragraph, we don't know, we don't have a name. We don't have a sense of why the old couple is important. The old couple gets introduced, but we don't know why they matter. Initially, we don't know how old the speaker is, except that we kind of know that he's probably not an elderly person because he wouldn't refer to another elderly couple as the old couple. We get introduced a little later because he's being educated by his mother that, okay, we're looking at a child that's fairly young, not maybe 9, 10 years old. We also pick up on the fact that he's clearly homeschooled. We pick up on the fact that it's pretty religious because you have the floods and the locusts and everything. So we get the sense that he's very isolated. So the character is getting build, but gradually. And there's a whole lot more that we don't know than what we do. And the writer is forcing us to sort of piece this character together as we go forward. We kind of like him because he's interesting. Um, his memory was strong. His mother's words found a home in his mind the moment they left her mouth. So most days he passed his afternoon study time staring out the window and down at the bridge, which was the only thing he could see between the trees. All right, so he's a really observant kid. He listens. He's interested in what his parents tell him, but he's also questioning them. He's at that point where he's starting to notice that everything that his parents say isn't necessarily true, that he can't trust them to always give him the truth or tell him the truth. And so that comes into the story. Now, this is the sort of weird moment that he witnesses. Minutes passed that way before the couple began untucking and unbuttoning their shirts, then stepping out of their sandals and unbuckling their belts and their pants and taking off those things, as well as the things underneath, and pushing the clothes all into a pile that the man picked up and dropped over the rail. They threw their hats too, and then they just stood there again. Only now they were both naked, and he squinted. It looked like they were both bald. He blinked several times, then held his eyes closed, and when he opened his eyes, the couple was still there, still naked. He glanced at his bedroom door, which was closed. He could hear his mother whistling, water splashing in the kitchen. When he turned back to the window, he pressed his nose to the screen and watched the old couple take a step closer and hold their faces together in a way that may have meant kissing. And then he watched as they turned and gripped the rail and eased themselves over one leg at a time. And even as they fell, they never made a sound. Okay, climax, right? This is the thing that happens. But again, it's fascinating. It's one of those things that you watch. And I think about certain things that have happened to me in my life, things that I'm convinced happened but don't make any sense to me. And I won't, spend your time here talking about them. But we all have these moments. But this takes the moment very seriously. It describes it in incredible detail. We know we should trust this narrator, by the way, because we know previously from the story that he's very observant, has a very good memory, he's very smart. Of course, we also know that as much as he shouldn't trust his parents, maybe his worldview is somewhat limited. What does he have really to be able to, if context is meaning, how much context does this kid have to draw from? So everything is a mystery to him, but this would be a mystery to most people. If you're reading this carefully, you're asking your own questions as a reader. Why are the people bald? Do they have cancer? One possibility, even though the boy calls only one of them the man, if he hasn't seen a woman naked and is in a religious family, it's possible that both of these people are men. He doesn't know what he's looking at is the upshot of it. And neither do we, because we are limited through point of view, through his limited perspective, literally his vantage point from the window and his processing ability. We try as readers to push beyond that and come to our own conclusions, but we only have the evidence that the narrator, this child, provides us. So there's so many gaps in here. What's interesting about this story is it uses that gaps. It doesn't really try to resolve them. It never answers the question, what happened? What did he see? What happened to the people? There are no bodies underneath the bridge. There was no splash in the water. And so the parents just decided it didn't happen. He must have imagined it. And in fact, he couldn't have seen anything because that would have meant he wasn't doing his homework. He was staring out the window, so the kid just agrees with them. But he has to solve the problem. So he does what a child does, and he uses his imagination, which is what the reader is doing too. It couldn't be nothing. He kept thinking and thinking until he finally he thought birds. The old couple were birds, or rather they had become birds. He closed his eyes and saw it all again, the couple, the undressing, everything as before. But this time, before they hit the ground, their bodies shrank and their arms turned flat and wide, flapping. He saw it again and again, each time a little clearer. Their mouths became beaks, they sprouted feathers, their eyes turned shiny and small and black, and their toes curled and sharpened like talons. They looked like hawks, and they dipped their talons down in the water. but there weren't any fish there. So the old couple flew on. They circled back under the bridge and up into the woods where there were mice and worms and rabbits, because to a bird, these things would taste good. And actually, he himself had eaten a rabbit before, though he hadn't realized this at the time. So what has he done? Okay, well, I saw what I saw. So what happened to these people? If they didn't hit the ground, they must have flown. So then they must have become birds. To a child who has no experience, and of course, why would he be able to believe this? Well, look at his education. He's being asked to believe in the Bible. And the Bible is full of mythic stories, transformative stories. And if you can believe in death and resurrection, if you can believe in the story of Elijah, if you can believe in Moses and the Dead Sea, well, why wouldn't you believe in two people becoming birds, right? So it's entirely possible to this child that this is what happened. Now, the reader, it doesn't satisfy the reader at all, except imaginatively. It's a beautiful conceit, a beautiful idea, but it doesn't really help us to know. And so we are left without really knowing the answer to the fundamental question of the piece, but we know this child very well, and perhaps even get glimmers of what kind of a person this child is to become, which ultimately this story is what the story is about. It's about this child and how we learn and how we become, and how we learn in some ways to distrust ourselves and what we see, to lose our faith in magic, and to lose our faith in our parents, which is all about growth and development. We are left as readers without knowing what happened, but in a weirdly satisfying way. I'm going to do the stop share now. But you see, and I didn't even mention how he's clearly jumping around all over the place in terms of time frame here, in structure. So pay attention to that story and how much he achieves in a very short. So I think the story is only 2 or 3 pages. Daniel O'Malley is a master craftsman. By the way, if you like that story, Daniel O'Malley is our fiction instructor, is at Marshall University. He's actually a professor now. He was hired very recently, tenure track. And so we've got him on board. He's also the undergraduate coordinator, undergraduate chair. And so he is the person you want to go to if you're thinking about taking more courses in the creative writing program. I believe that story was in Best American Stories. So quite an excellent writer. You should get to know him. All right, that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoy O'Malley's story. I hope this gives you a little bit, just one more tool in your arsenal, which is not, again, you'll notice how vivid and descriptive that piece is, how much you see and hear and smell. It's not about not being generous to your reader with the materials, with the evocative materials that tell us, that put us in a world and introduce us to a character. It's about leaving gaps concerning motivation, knowledge, history, backstory, things like that, that can actually force the reader to dive even further into those characters and have an even greater investment in the outcome of the story. All right, that's all I've got for today. I hope this was somewhat helpful, and I will see you all very soon.